Richard Nixon is a typical underdog story. The son of a grocery clerk, he worked his way up the political ranks and served as a vice president for 8 years under Eisenhower. He received the Republican nomination in 1960. Nixon quickly fell, losing the election to John F. Kennedy. Trying to keep his nose in politics, Nixon ran for governor of his home state, California, but failed. Nixon then became a lawyer and worked at a firm. While at the firm, Nixon didn't stay too far away from politics. He supported the Republicans in the 1964 election. In 1967, he decided to run for president a second time. During his campaign, Nixon took a conservative approach that coincided with the countrywide conservative movement, thus propelling himself into the White House in 1968.
While Nixon's foreign policies were stellar back at home, his domestic policy was more like a falling star. When he came into office, the economy was several train wrecks tall and had rampant inflation, over 2 million people unemployed. Nixon himself believed he could fix it with Nixonomics. Using Nixonomics, he took the dollar up to gold standard, froze wage and prices for 90 days, and increased the deficit to $25.2 billion. Despite all this, it was only able to give temporary reprieve. This reprieve ended when inflation rose by 3.8%. The oil boycott began, and an era's worth of unstable prices and exponential inflation growth began to run rampant on his and his successors' terms. Socially, Nixon was no Roosevelt. While his environmental policy was fairly progressive and passed many times, his social policies of negative taxes and reformed welfare were too weak for either political spectrum to support. Possibly the most scarring part socially was the fact that he tried to fight the civil rights movement, even going so far to try to fight the Brown versus Board of Education ruling and opposing the extension of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. His biggest principles was his pledge to shift power from the central government to the states.
Nixon loved dealing with foreign issues. The first thing he did after stepping into his presidency was Vietnamization. It was very popular among the US. The second thing that Nixon based his foreign policy off of was Henry Kissinger and his philosophy, which was known as Realpolitik. This was German for political realism. What this meant was that the foreign policy should be based solely off of the consideration of power. For example, China and the Soviet Union were major world powers, so the US would spend its time and efforts there instead of smaller, less powerful countries. This marked the end of containment and started calling for the US to confront powerful nations. To deal with communism, they adopted a new policy called Détente, a policy aimed at easing Cold War tensions. Nixon was very strong anti-communist, but decided to visit China. This was a huge success, so 3 months later he visited Moscow. In addition to this, they agreed on creating the famous SALT talks, which limited nuclear weaponry. Overall, his foreign policy was a major success in accomplishing all of its goals and was one of the best by any president.
While Nixon did undoubtedly have several successful foreign diplomacies, his administration was marred by many scandals, and most infamously, the Watergate scandal. The scandal itself was centered around Nixon and his administration. It all started when a burglary at the Watergate office in DC occurred. The guard on duty caught 5 men trying to break in. Their goal had been the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. These men were sent to steal the Democratic Party's election strategy and to wiretap the room. The next day, the head of the burglars, James McCord, was found, and the ringleader of the whole burglary, President Nixon, quickly began a cover-up. He gave permission to shred any incriminating documents and made the FBI cease investigations. The scandal disappeared, and Nixon was re-elected in 1972. But 2 journalists from the Washington Post kept investigating and uncovering facts. In 1973, the trials for the burglars began. During the trials, James McCord sent a letter to the judge and admitted that members of Nixon's administration had been tied to the scandal. Nixon acted quickly and dismissed those members of his administration, but it was too late, as the Senate had already launched an investigation. In the trial, a man named Alexander Butterfield revealed that Nixon had recorded all conversations in the Democratic Party's headquarters. In the end, the court ruled that Nixon must release the unedited tapes. Once heard, Nixon was charged with conspiracy, obstruction, and perjury. But before he could be impeached, President Nixon left office, never admitting guilt. Nixon's legacy can essentially be described like a workaholic's life. Foreignly, he accomplished many things and was considered amazing. Domestically, however, he was a wreck, throwing his country into massive inflation, failing to get social policies passed, and worst of all, besmirching the people's trust with the Watergate scandal.
Gerald Ford served as the vice president under Nixon and came into office when Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal.
Due to his inexperience in presidential matters, Ford decided to follow Nixon's domestic policy, even going so far as to keep the same domestic policy advisors as Nixon. Ford would continue Nixon's policy of gradualism throughout his term. He also tried to save the inflated economy by cutting government spending and raising interest rates. He also had battles with Congress in which he vetoed more than 50 pieces of legislation.
Foreign policy-wise, Ford followed Nixon's lead and saw three major things: detente with the Soviets, repairing ties with China, and supporting South Vietnam's government. By far his biggest accomplishment was the signing of the Helsinki Accords, a series of agreements that promised greater cooperation between Eastern and Western European countries.
Gerald Ford's legacy, while not as bad as his predecessors, was relatively tepid. One of the largest impacts was the fact he chose to pardon former President Nixon. This hastened the country's shift of attention from the scandal. Overall, however, his administration had the same flaws and strengths as Nixon: strong foreign, weak domestic, plagued with inflation, and lack of either party's support.